There is an island off the coast of East Africa, 2 kilometers long, 500 meters wide, connected to the mainland by a single bridge. On that island there is a fort. It took 62 years to build. Its walls are 3 meters thick. Every stone was cut by hand and shipped from Portugal across 6,000 kilometers of open ocean. When it was finished in 1620, it was the largest Portuguese fortification in the entire southern hemisphere. The fort was never taken by force. In 400 years of empire, not one enemy army breached those walls. Today, the island has about 15,000 people. There are no tourists. There is one functioning hospital. There is no industry. The palace where governors once received delegations from Lisbon sits open to the wind, its plaster peeling, its ceilings collapsed in sections. Portugal spent 400 years turning this island into the heart of its African empire. Then, in a single administrative decision, it moved the capital to a city 2,000 kilometers south and forgot this place existed. This is Mozambique Island. And this is what happens when an empire simply walks away. To understand why Portugal built an empire on a 2-kilometer coral island, you have to understand what 1498 looked like from Lisbon. Vasco da Gama had just done something no European navigator had managed before. He rounded the southern tip of Africa and opened a sea route to India. That route, east along the African coast, northeast across the Indian Ocean, would become the most valuable shipping lane in the world for the next 2 centuries. Whoever controlled the waypoints along it controlled the spice trade. And the spice trade, in the 15th century, was worth more than gold. Portugal was a small country, smaller than the state of Indiana, with a population of perhaps 1 million people. It had no business running an empire. But it had ships, navigators, and a particular institutional ambition that would eventually punch far above its weight for nearly 200 years. When da Gama's fleet reached the East African coast in March of 1498, his pilots noted something useful: a small coral island about 2 kilometers long, protected from the open sea by a shallow reef, with a natural deepwater harbor on its western side. The local sultan was already running it as a trading post. Arab merchants had been stopping there for centuries on the dhow routes between the Persian Gulf and the Swahili coast. Da Gama noted the harbor. He noted the position, roughly the midpoint of the African coast, equidistant from the Cape of Good Hope and the entrance to the Red Sea. And he noted that whoever held this island would hold a choke point on the route to India. Portugal came back in 1507. By 1522, they had built the first chapel on the island, the Chapel of Nossa Senhora de Baluarte. It still stands today. It is the oldest European building in the southern hemisphere, still in continuous use, 500 years old, made of coral stone and lime, plastered white, facing the sea. For Portugal, Mozambique Island was never meant to be a colony in the modern sense. It was a logistics node, a place to resupply ships, take on fresh water, repair sails, treat sick sailors, a way station on the road to Goa and Calicut and the pepper markets of Malabar. But logistics nodes have a way of becoming capitals. Trade follows infrastructure. Infrastructure generates administration. Administration requires a governor, a garrison, a courthouse, a cathedral. By the middle of the 16th century, Mozambique Island had all of these things, and by 1558, the Portuguese crown made a decision that would define the island for the next 3 centuries. They would build a fortress here, not a trading post with walls, a proper military fortification designed to be permanent. Construction on Fort São Sebastião began in 1558. It would not be completed until 1620, 62 years. The delay was not incompetence, it was distance. Every piece of construction material, lime, masonry, iron fittings, timber for the scaffolding, had to be sourced in Portugal and shipped across the Indian Ocean. A single supply voyage took 6 to 8 months. If a shipment was lost to storm or to the Dutch privateers who were beginning to prey on Portuguese routes, the project stopped and waited for the next sailing season. The walls, when they finally closed, were 3 meters thick at the base. The fort was designed by Italian military engineers following the Trace Italienne, the angular bastion system developed in response to artillery. Rounded towers were vulnerable to cannon fire. Angled bastions deflect shots and eliminate blind spots. The same geometry was being used in Malta, in Cyprus, in the fortifications of the Spanish Netherlands. Here it was reproduced in coral limestone on a spit of rock in the Indian Ocean. Inside the fort, barracks for 300 soldiers, a chapel, cisterns capable of holding enough fresh water for a year-long siege, magazines for powder and shot. Outside its walls, a town that by the 17th century held merchants from Portugal, India, Arabia, and China. A cathedral that was, briefly, the largest church on the East African coast. The fort was tested almost immediately. In 1607, a Dutch fleet of 11 ships appeared off the island. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was then the most powerful commercial entity in the world, and it was systematically dismantling the Portuguese trading network across the Indian Ocean. It had taken Malacca. It would soon take Ceylon. Mozambique Island was a logical target. If the Dutch could sever Portugal's African way station, they could cut the supply line to what remained of the Estado de India. The attack lasted 26 days. The Dutch had more ships, more cannon, and more men, but they could not breach the walls. The fort held, and the fleet withdrew. It happened again in 1608, same result. The Portuguese would hold Mozambique Island against the Dutch, against the Omani Arabs who seized much of the Swahili coast in the 17th century, against the British privateers who occasionally tested the harbor. In 400 years, no enemy force ever took Fort São Sebastião by direct assault. Its walls simply worked. The geometry held. The Italian engineers had done their job. By the 18th century, the island had settled into a rhythm. Ships arrived from Goa and Lisbon and Macau. Merchants traded cloth, ivory, and increasingly enslaved people. The Portuguese were running one of the major nodes of the East African slave trade out of Mozambique Island, shipping captives to Brazil, to India, to the plantations of the Mascarene Islands. The island's prosperity was inseparable from this commerce. The governor's palace, the hospital founded in 108-77 that is still functioning today, the network of churches and warehouses and administrative buildings, all of it was built on an economy that included human trafficking as a core component. This is not incidental. It is the reason the island was worth holding. Control the coast. Control the ivory caravans coming down from the interior. Control the dhow traffic. And you controlled the flow of people and goods across a continent. Mozambique Island was not just a military post. It was a sorting mechanism for empire. The town that grew around the fort was layered like most colonial outposts. The northern end, the stone town, was Portuguese in character. Whitewashed buildings with terracotta roofs, a grid of narrow streets. A governor's palace built in stages over 2 centuries, eventually acquiring an Italianate facade that looked almost credible if you didn't think too hard about where you were. The southern end, the Makuti town, was made of coral rubble and palm thatch, local in construction, African in density. 2 entirely different worlds separated by perhaps 800 meters of coral road. At its peak in the 19th century, Mozambique Island had a population approaching 30,000. For perspective, at the same moment, the city of Lourenço Marques, the settlement 2,000 kilometers south at the bottom of Delagoa Bay, which would eventually become Maputo, the capital of modern Mozambique, had fewer than 1,000 residents. The island was the center, everything else was the periphery. The harbor was the problem. It had always been the problem, but for most of the island's history, the problem was manageable. 16th century carracks drew perhaps 4 meters of water. The harbor could take them, but ships got bigger. By the 19th century, the steamships replacing sail required deeper drafts. The reef that had protected Mozambique Island from attack now prevented the largest modern vessels from entering the harbor at all. There was a second problem. The island's position, which had once been its advantage, was now its liability. When Portugal arrived in 1498, the route to India went up the East African coast, across the Indian Ocean, and around the bottom of the subcontinent. But the Suez Canal opened in 1869. Suddenly, the fastest route from Europe to Asia went through the Mediterranean, not around Africa. The East African way station was no longer on the main road. It was a detour. The decision was made in 1898. The capital of Portuguese East Africa, officially named Mozambique after the island, would move to Lourenço Marques. There was no dramatic crisis. No military defeat, no revolution. The harbor was too shallow for modern ships. The position was too far north for a colony whose economic gravity had shifted toward the Zambezi Valley and the south. Lourenço Marques had a better harbor, a railroad being built into the Transvaal, and a growing trade with the South African interior. So, the governor packed his files and his furniture and sailed south. The cathedral's diocese followed. The military garrison reduced. The merchants, reading the direction of commerce, began to follow the capital. The island did not empty overnight. These processes never do. Portuguese administrators stayed on through the early 20th century. A small garrison remained in the fort. The hospital kept functioning. The town kept its population for a while, sustained partly by inertia, partly by the fishing economy, partly by the fact that poor people do not relocate simply because a government decides to move its offices. But the investment stopped. The buildings that had taken 2 centuries to construct began their slow return to the sea air. Plaster cracked. Roofs failed. The governor's palace acquired the particular silence of rooms that no longer receive anyone important. When Mozambique gained independence from Portugal in 1975, the island was already a backwater within its own country. The new government in Maputo had no particular reason to prioritize a coral island in the far north. There was a civil war to fight. The Renamo insurgency would kill nearly 1 million people and displace 5 million more before it ended in 1992. There was an economy to rebuild. There were roads to maintain and schools to open. Mozambique Island got UNESCO World Heritage status in 1991. The designation was recognition of something remarkable. The island had changed so little in the past century that it had become, almost accidentally, one of the best preserved examples of colonial Portuguese architecture anywhere in the world. The buildings were crumbling, yes, but they were crumbling in their original forms. No one had knocked them down to build something modern. There was not enough money to knock them down. Today, you reach the island by a bridge, built in 1969 during the late colonial period, 3.5 kilometers long, the only fixed connection to the mainland. Drive across it, and the island announces itself as a place that has been waiting for something that is not coming. The fort stands intact. Its walls are exactly as the Italian engineers designed them in the 16th century. The chapel of Nossa Senhora de Baluarte, built in 1522, still has its original vaulted ceiling. Visitors who come, and there are not many, can walk its interior and stand on the same coral stone floor that was laid by craftsmen born before Shakespeare was born. The palace is open to the elements in sections. The cisterns still hold water. The barracks are empty. In the stone town, perhaps 60 or 70 of the historic buildings are in serious decay. Some have already collapsed into their foundations. The property lines are still visible. The colonial grid survives in the streets, but what stood on those plots is sometimes just rubble and the memory of a roofline. The Makuti town is alive. People live there. Children run through the streets. Fishing boats go out in the morning and come back with the evening tide. The island has roughly 13,000 residents today, less than half the population it held at its colonial peak. They are not Portuguese. They are Makua and Swahili, and the descendants of every community that passed through 400 years of Indian Ocean trade. They live in the shadow of a fort that their ancestors did not build, in a city that was designed for an empire that is no longer here. The hospital, the one founded in 1877, is still running. It is, by some measures, one of the oldest continuously operating hospitals in Africa. It has new equipment now, donated by international NGOs, but the building it occupies was designed by Portuguese engineers when Lourenço Marques was still a small settlement, when Mozambique Island was still the capital, when there was still reason to believe this place would matter. There have been restoration efforts. UNESCO has funded some work. The Portuguese government has contributed. But restoration at this scale, hundreds of historic buildings on a low-income island without significant economic activity, is an essentially impossible project without sustained international commitment. The pace of decay exceeds the pace of repair. What you find on Mozambique Island now is not picturesque ruin in the romantic sense. It is something quieter and stranger, a city that functioned as the center of an ocean-spanning empire for 400 years, then was simply deprioritized into obsolescence. No war, no catastrophe, just a harbor that was too shallow for modern ships, and a canal that made the route irrelevant. The fort that was never taken by force now stands guard over a town that the empire that built it stopped needing. The walls are still 3 meters thick. The geometry still works. There is just nothing left to defend. Empires do not always end with battles. Sometimes they end with a bureaucratic decision, a memo from a colonial ministry recommending that administrative headquarters be moved to a more convenient location. Sometimes they end with a harbor survey that concludes the draft is too shallow for modern vessels. Sometimes they end with a canal opening 6,000 kilometers away that makes a way station irrelevant. Mozambique Island was built to last. The Portuguese understood that. They spent 62 years building walls that could not be broken, and 400 more years filling the space inside those walls with everything an empire requires: churches, courts, palaces, hospitals, prisons, warehouses, chapels. They built it to endure, and it did endure. That is the strange part of the story. The fort is intact. The chapel from 1522 still has its original ceiling. The grid of streets the Portuguese laid out in the 16th century is still the grid of streets you walk today. The place did not fall. It was not destroyed. It was simply no longer needed. There is a category of forgetting that is more complete than destruction. When a building is demolished, its absence marks the place where it stood. When a city is bombed, the ruins become evidence. But when an empire quietly relocates its offices and stops investing in a place, the place continues to exist. It just exists outside the narrative, outside the story anyone is telling about themselves. Mozambique Island kept going after Portugal left. It keeps going now. 13,000 people live their lives on 2 kilometers of coral, under the walls of a fort that was never defeated, in the shadow of a city that the empire forgot, the place's power forgot. Subtle CTA, últimas 10 segundos. There is another city like this. Another place where a colonial government made one infrastructural decision and left an entire capital behind. That one is in South America. And it involves a president who was so convinced his project would succeed that he named the city after himself. That story is next. Lugar exato, Ilha de Moçambique, Nampula province, Mozambique, Cords, 15 degrees 0155 seconds south, 40 degrees, 44:55 seconds. E fatos ancora verificáveis. Vasco da Gama chegou 1498. Palavras do roteiro, 3.80, dentro do range 3,000 to 4,500. Duração estimada TTS, 22-24 minutes. Ritmo lento documentary sexenas 20 palavras per minute. Padrão de título usado. E próximo EP sugerido na coda, EP 19. India built a capital for one state, then lost it to